Hi, I'm starting a series of videos on practical paradoxes. These are puzzles that arise in ethical theory and related areas. They don't get as much attention as I think they really deserve, and so I want to explain them. They're usually fairly easy to explain, but not so easy to solve. I'm going to start with the most obscure of these paradoxes. I call it Rhinox paradox. I name it that after Adolf Reinach. He's the person who came up with it in 3 essays that he wrote on ethics. They're the only things he wrote on ethics. Primarily he's known for his work in psychology and legal theory. His own life is a remarkable life and a short life. He was born in 1883. He studied at Munich and then at Tübingen. He got his doctorate there at the age of 20, which is remarkable in philosophy or really any other field. Then he went to Göttingen, where he studied with Edmund Husserl, and then joined the faculty at Göttingen. In 1914, when the First World War broke out, he felt compelled by patriotism to sign up for the army, which he did, and he ended up dying on a battlefield in Flanders. So his life was short, but nevertheless it was a life full of achievement, and I want to talk about one of the puzzles that he raised in connection with ethical theory. Before I get into the details of the puzzle, I'll just sketch a little bit about his approach to ethics. He developed it in 3 papers: Basic Concepts of Ethics, Reflection, Its Ethical and Legal Significance, and Basic Features of Ethics. His ethics centers on the concept of a social act. His idea is that it is social acts that lie at the foundation of all our practical reasoning and all of our ethical reasoning. They, in particular, generate obligations. And so it's important from Rhinox's point of view not to think about ethics in the abstract. It is something that arises in community. It's something that arises in society as a result of things we do as social animals. We interact with other people. We make promises to them, for example, and by obligation arises out of that social act of promising. Now, it wouldn't exist as an act of promising unless there was already a social institution or a set of norms or practices in my society that made it an act of promising. If we had no concept of promising, then no matter what I say, it wouldn't count as a promise. And so, a promise is something that takes place socially. It's something that depends on a certain pattern of social interaction. Well, he thinks that all of our obligations really have that sort of foundation. They all stem from patterns of social interaction and social acts that occur against the background of those patterns, those expectations. And here, a norm, as a social norm, is not to be understood as something that is itself from outside of that social element and governing it. Instead, it's something that arises out of our social interactions and conventions. So what is Rhinox's paradox? Well, it has to do with the concept of reflection and the nature of reflection from a normative point of view. So we could put it this way. It really has to do with the nature of moral evaluation and the way in which it depends on the state of mind and the process mentally that the agent undergoes. So we can think of it as a matter of, well, charting degrees of rightness or wrongness, goodness or badness, against degrees of reflection involved in an action. And he comes up with some surprising observations about this. He says, I can't quite make sense of it. It looks as if our practices are in some way incoherent, hence the paradox or the puzzle. Now, I'm not sure this is a paradox in the sense of really exactly generating a contradiction. It just gives us a puzzling phenomenon that calls out for some kind of explanation. And Rhinox himself doesn't really have such an explanation. He simply points out a puzzling feature of the role of reflection, the role of premeditation, the role of deliberation, of thinking things through in connection with our social acts, those things that generate moral obligations or moral evaluations. So, what's the point? What's the general idea? Well, the thought is this. Suppose we begin with an act that is clearly wrong, a murder, let's say. And then we think about the degree of wrongness of that. Now, a murder is always a really bad thing, so it's already a high degree of wrongness. But now we vary the amount of deliberation involved, the amount of reflection, the amount of premeditation. And we think, at first, suppose that's just 0. The murder takes place. It is the intentional killing of a human being. But on the other hand, there was no premeditation or reflection at all. It was done on the spur of the moment, immediately, impulsively. Well, in that case, yes, it's a very bad thing, second-degree murder maybe in many jurisdictions, but on the other hand, we wouldn't think of it as being as bad as certain other kinds of murders. Now, suppose the murder takes place after some degree of deliberation. Suppose it is premeditated. Well, that tends to raise the level of badness. It makes it worse. And the more deliberation, you might think, the worse it becomes. Suppose the person has been plotting this murder for quite some time. Well, that seems worse than actually deliberating for a few seconds or a few minutes or something like that. It looks as if in that case this person has been planning this murder for quite a long time. And the longer it is, you might say, in some sense, the worse it becomes. Now, maybe there's some limit to this. You've been planning the murder for 20 years? Well, at least the victim got to live those 20 years, so maybe after a certain point it just hits a maximum. But at any rate, within a certain span, it looks as if adding reflection, adding time for deliberation, adding premeditation makes the wrongness of the action worse. And so if we chart degrees of badness against amount of deliberation, it looks like we get a positive sloping line. Now, maybe it's not exactly linear, but the general idea is that it has a positive slope. It gets worse and worse up to, at any rate, a certain point as we increase the amount of deliberation. But now let's consider a good action. Suppose it's a matter of helping somebody who needs help. You find out that a neighbor is really suffering. They could use maybe some financial help. Maybe it's just a matter of bringing them groceries or doing some errands for them. Whatever it is, there's some kind of good you can do. Now, how does the goodness of the action vary with the amount of deliberation or reflection or premeditation? In this case, Rhinox says, it's not so clear. Now, when you look at the negative action, the murder, and you see this positive sloping line, more deliberation makes it worse. There are two hypotheses that immediately spring to mind. One of them is that increasing the amount of deliberation or reflection makes an action worse. That would explain the upward sloping line. But the other possibility is that it simply intensifies the moral quality of the action. So you might think, yes, whatever it is, whether it's a good or bad action, it makes it more so. So bad actions become worse with premeditation. Good actions become better with premeditation. And so we, on the basis of thinking about the murder case, could think, okay, there are two ways of contemplating all of this. When we turn to good actions, we might have one hypothesis that predicts good actions will get worse after deliberation, and another hypothesis that says they will get better. But in both cases, in something like that linear fashion, at least up to a certain point. Now, Rhinox says that's what we would expect, and we might use the good case as a way of deciding between these two hypotheses. But actually, he says we don't find either one. Suppose I do help this neighbor, but do it purely impulsively. Find out the person needs help, I right away go run the errand, or give them a check, or whatever it is. And so, impulsively, it's a good action. Now, suppose I deliberate. Suppose I think, oh, they're in trouble. I should help them. And then I think about it. Well, he says that makes it even better. Instead of just immediately doing something, I'm actually doing it with some degree of deliberation, some degree of intentionality. I'm thinking maybe about the best way to accomplish the end. And so he says that seems to make the action even better. However, only up to a point. If I take long enough to deliberate, to decide, to reflect on this, to premeditate, he said, then it doesn't look like so good an action anymore. And so he says we don't observe the phenomenon either of deliberation making a good action worse or deliberation making a good action better. Instead, deliberation seems to make a good action better up to a certain point, and then it starts making it worse. We get something like a curve. And so we don't get anything looking like a line here. If anything, it starts looking more like a parabola. Now, it's not exactly, as I said, a contradiction. But it's weird, isn't it, that the effect of deliberation or reflection or premeditation on moral evaluation doesn't seem to have the same character with respect to good actions and bad actions. Deliberation seems to make bad actions worse. On the other hand, deliberation seems to make good actions better up to a certain point, but then after that point, further deliberation seems to make it worse. So how can we explain the divergence? Rhinox's idea seems to be that there is a bit of a contradiction here. We would expect the effect of increased deliberation on a moral evaluation to be consistent, whether the action is good or bad. It either makes, in general, things more intense with respect to whatever the moral evaluation is, or it makes things generally better or generally worse. And we don't find any of those things. We appear to find that its effect is not uniform. It does not have a consistent effect on moral evaluation, on goodness and badness of actions. And so he's puzzled by that. Now, how could we explain this?